Hello, everyone, and welcome to our LIR presentation for today. I'm very pleased to have with us today someone you've heard from many times, actually, probably over the years. He gave wonderful updates on the COVID situation for several years. Um, and I'm happy to say that John Swartzberg is now also a member of the committee that oversees the LIR program. In any case, he's a clinical faculty member at Berkeley and now in emeritus status. That means he was a practicing he is a practicing physician, but he also has been teaching in the School of Public Health. Um, and he's in the department in the area of infectious diseases and vaccinology. And he also has an important role to play in the Berkeley Wellness Letter. He chairs the editorial board for that now and has done for many years. Um, he's an expert on infectious diseases and vaccines, and that's one reason we've asked him here today to hear from him again, now not about COVID, but about avian influenza. So I don't think you need to hear much more about him because he's so familiar to you. So let's get started right now, John. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be back talking to you, but here we are again. Seems like we just got through with COVID and now we're talking about the possibility of another pandemic. Oh, the times. So today we'll be talking about avian influenza. And spoiler alert, I don't know whether we're going to have a pandemic from avian influenza or not. So then I'll begin the talk with that, and I'll end the talk with that as well. So let's get started. Unfortunately, I have to give you a little microbiology background because a lot of the language I'm going to be using, I think, you're not going to be familiar with, or many of you are not familiar with. So let me just go through this fairly quickly. We're going to be talking about influenza A today, a particular type of influenza A, but I want to point out to you that there are 4 different types of influenza, A through D. I don't even list C and D here because C rarely causes human disease and D does not. But type A and type B do. What we've been seeing this influenza season is both type A and type B influenza. On the cartoon on the right-hand side, you see here's influenza A in the yellow. Oop. And influenza B is in the green. So there are different hosts for all of these. For example, influenza A infects birds, humans, and many other mammals, and it causes pandemics. Influenza B causes human disease, and sometimes in seals and pigs, but it is mainly human and pigs. And it causes epidemics, but it does not cause pandemics. So we're interested in influenza A. Also want to point out in this cartoon about the structure of the virus that there are 2 sites that I want you to pay particular attention to because you'll hear me refer to them. And they are the neuraminidase over here. There are 8 different types of neuraminidase. These are enzymes that the virus produces. And hemagglutinins. You see a cartoon picture of it over here. There are 18 types of hemagglutinins. And you'll be hearing me talk about the H and N types as we go along. Hemagglutinins are used for the virus to attach to get inside of our cells and replicate. And that will be our primary focus. So we've got influenza A, and then we've got different types of hemagglutinins and neuraminidase proteins on the surface. I'm afraid my slide is frozen right now. Let me see what I can do to.
Yeah, you could try unsharing and resharing.
There we go. It's working now. Great. Okay. This lists the 18 different types of influenza, as you see here on the left-hand side, and then which of the types infect humans, and you see that some of these do, and poultry and swine and so on. So types 1, 2, and 3 of the hemagglutinins types infect human beings, and they cause epidemics and they can cause pandemics. This year we're seeing primarily hemagglutinin 3 and hemagglutinin 1. But hemagglutinins 5, 6, 7, 9, and 10 also infect human beings, but very sporadically. So here's the one we're interested in, hemagglutinin 5, which is primarily a bird influenza virus, but occasionally it infects humans, occasionally it infects pigs, and it occasionally infects other mammals, and it occasionally, and now more frequently than ever, affects cattle. We'll be talking about influenza A H5. And I want to point out to you that influenza is primarily what we call a zoonotic infection. That is, the influenza viruses are primarily in the animal world. And of the animals, it's primarily birds. So birds are the primary reservoir for influenza, but occasionally influenza spills over to humans. And that's what we're worried about with H5. Some influenza viruses become what we call humanized, meaning that they've been in the human population now for centuries, and so they are really part of the human population. But originally, all of these viruses came from animals, primarily birds. And the last thing I want to talk to you about in terms of structure and function of these viruses is that influenza A has the ability to change itself in two ways. One way, it can have mutations, and these are point mutations in the genetic structure of the virus, the RNA, that leads to gradual change in the structure of the virus and what our immune system can recognize. The big thing with influenza A that none of the other influenza viruses can do is it can go through what we call antigenic shift, which means that the virus can reassort its RNA with another influenza virus that has a different RNA, so it can suddenly change dramatically. And when it changes dramatically and is able to infect human beings and transmit person to person, then that's when we see a pandemic. And then finally, I'll be talking about I've already talked to you about types of influenza, A and B, but there are subtypes, and that's based upon the hemagglutinin and the neuraminidase. So for example, we're interested today in influenza A, subtype H5N1. But then there's subtypes of that, or groups of that, and we call those clades. And then, of course, there are groups of those clades, and we call them subclades. So you'll hear me talking about the types, the subtypes, and the clades in a few moments. So now a little bit of history. The name influenza actually came from the Italian in the 15th century when there was apparently a large epidemic or perhaps pandemic of influenza in Italy. And the word meant influence of the stars, or influence. So that's where we got the name, because it was felt that every year when the stars are in a certain position, meaning late fall, winter, and early spring, we would see influenza visit us. In the 16th century, the first worldwide probable pandemic of influenza was documented. In the 19th century, there were 4 probable pandemics of influenza. The bottom line to this is that influenza has been with us for centuries. In the last 100 years, we've seen 4 pandemics from influenza. The first, of course, was far and away the worst that we've experienced, and that was the great influenza pandemic of 1918-1919, spilling over to 1920. It was called the Spanish flu for reasons that are sort of interesting, and that is that the world was at war. Spain was at that time neutral. The Germans didn't want to claim that they had influenza or started influenza. The Americans didn't want to claim that they did it, nor did the other Europeans. So the neutral country, Spain, was blamed for influenza. This particular influenza, H1N1, that killed probably around 50, 75 maybe 100 million people in a 2-year span of time. And this particular influenza came from the United States, probably from the Midwest. In 1957, there was what was called the Asian flu, H2N2. This killed about 2 million people over about a year. In 68, there was what was called the Hong Kong flu, or the H3N2, and that killed also roughly about 2 million people in approximately a year. And in 2009, you will all remember that there was the swine flu H1N1 influenza. This was not nearly as virulent. It killed probably around 200,000 people on the planet, so not nearly as virulent as the others that we had. So in the last 100 years, we've had 4 pandemics from influenza. The question, of course, is, are we going to see another one? And when will we see it? So the bottom line to this discussion is that influenza has been with us for a long time. It occurs every year in a temporally predictable fashion, late fall, winter, early spring. Type A causes episodic pandemics. And the nomenclature, as you've already appreciated, is very confusing. These are zoonotic infections coming from animals, that the RNA of the virus can go through antigenic drift and shift, and that there are subtypes of the virus, and there are clades of the virus, and there are subclades to the virus. So let's look at the history of influenza H5N1, often called bird flu because it's a virus that comes from birds. This was first identified in 1959. In 1996, these H5N1 viruses were recognized to evolve into distinct antigenic clades and some clades, and this was by reassortment that I was talking to you about before. And then it was recognized to spread by wild birds and poultry in Asia, and then to greater than 50 countries between 2004 and 2007. These countries were all in Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. H5N1, a particular type of the H5N1 called clade 2.3.4, first emerged in 2008. This is the clade that we're particularly interested in because this is what is now spreading throughout all the Americas and to other parts of the world. It was first recognized to spread globally in 2016. And in late 2021, it was introduced to North America. So this particular clade of H5N1 has only been here since in the last 4 years. It came from Eurasia and disseminated to the Americas via wild birds. And since then, it's spread to infect more than 50 mammalian species. It devastated, for example, the seal population in South America, many different bird populations throughout all the Americas, and along with at least 50 other mammals. This just gives you a sense of some of the mammals that have been infected by this particular clade. So let me summarize for you. We're talking about influenza A H5N1 and a particular clade, 2.3.4.4. And there are 2 subclades of that. There's B3.13 that's mainly in cows, and mostly in humans, it's asymptomatic or very mild disease. But the other 2 clades, the D clades, 1.1 and 1.3, are mainly in wild and domesticated birds. And recently, D1.1 jumped to dairy cattle, just like B3.13 had. And there have been 4 human cases of D1.1, 2 severe and 1 fatal. And that's all in the last year. So the bottom line to this discussion is that there are two types of H5N1, 2.3.4.4. Both are evolving to infect multiple other mammals. We're continuing to see on a regular basis different mammals becoming infected. The virus is, to anthropomorphize it, the virus is learning how to find new homes to multiply in. The D types are more virulent for humans than the B types. At least that's what the current evidence tells us. So why are we concerned? Economic damage. When it occurs in humans, it has a high rate of, can cause fatality at high rates. And genetic changes may lead to a humanized form of the virus where the virus can not only infect humans, but then transmit human to human. Those are the three reasons we're so concerned. Let's look at how this virus transmits. On the left-hand side, you see the wild birds that carry the virus. Some birds die from this virus. Many others, for example, ducks, don't get sick at all, but they can spread the virus. This is what typically infects poultry that can then infect humans. This is what has infected cows. For example, the first cases of dairy herds being infected were in Texas from wild birds that had spread the virus to cows. And then cows can spread it to humans. And we'll talk more about that in a moment. So in terms of how birds spread it to people, the birds shed the virus through their mucus, saliva, and feces in the ground. This dries and can get aerosolized, so we can breathe in the viral particles that have been aerosolized. We can also get it by touching the virus where the mucus, saliva, or feces of the bird have touched, and then taking our hands and putting it to our eyes, nose, or mouth and infecting ourselves that way. But we can also get it from dairy herds, cows. We didn't know that the virus could infect the udders of cows until about 14 months ago. This was all brand new to us. Once infecting the udders, of course, the milk gets infected. There are billions of viral particles in the milk. So when these cows are being milked, the milk can get aerosolized, and that can land on your eyes, for example, or you could have it on your hands and bring your hands to your eyes, nose, or mouth, and you could get infected that way. Or the milk could just splash and get into your eyes. And we think that it could also spread by consuming unpasteurized milk or milk products, or inhaling droplets of milk. So these are the two ways we're seeing H5N1, this particular clade, these two subclades infecting human beings. So let's look at the epidemiology, the current status of infection, both in animals as well as humans. Currently, since 2016, we've seen about 170 million birds affected, with a mortality rate approaching 100% in many birds. This year alone, we've seen over 1 million birds affected. That's here in the United States. In dairy herds and wild captive mammals, we see on the left, on this side, that to date, just under 1,000 cattle from 17 states have been infected, with the western states being the most prevalent. In terms of wild and captive mammals, again, the western states are most affected, and there are many, many different mammals, as I pointed out, that have been infected with this virus. If we look at humans, there have been a total of 70 cases reported in the last 14 months. This is through March 28th, so just a couple of days ago in terms of reporting. 41 of those human cases came from cattle, dairy herds. 24 came from poultry farms and culling operations. There were 2 other animal exposures. They're not well documented. And there were 3 exposures where there's not a known source. Most of the cases have been in the western states, as you see here. The bottom line to this discussion is that H5N1, this particular clade, is devastating for many birds. There's a pandemic occurring now. It's just not occurring in humans. It's occurring primarily in birds. There are multiple opportunities for this virus to transmit to humans. Right now, humans are an incidental host. By that, I mean that we are not a host that the birds, this particular virus, is rapidly multiplying in. And there is no human-to-human transmission yet. There's also no sustained human-to-human transmission yet. These are the 2 things that we're looking for. So let's now look at the question of how do we get infected. I was talking to you earlier about these hemagglutinin types, and I mentioned that only H1, H2, and A3 are humanized. These are the only influenza viruses that readily infect humans and that spread human to human. H5 viruses, I mentioned, have circulated for decades, but they've never caused a human pandemic. So we've known about these viruses for several decades, and although there have been just under 1,000 cases, with a mortality rate of those cases documented at about 50%, 48%, this virus has not, quote, learned how to spread person to person. Why is that? We think it's best explained by how viruses attach to our cells. For a virus to survive, it has to get inside of our cells, take over our cellular machinery, and reproduce. So it's all about how do the viruses get inside of our cells. It's a lock and key situation. So the lock is the hemagglutinin, and the key is receptor sites that on the virus that can attach to particular receptor sites in the hemagglutinin and then get inside of our cells. These on our cells are what are called sialic acids, just a particular molecule, and there are a variety of types, and they're bound to a sugar, and there are a variety of different linkages that we have. Humans have primarily what's called an alpha-2,6 linkage. Birds primarily have an alpha-2,3 linkage. And the virus has a very difficult time getting into human cells because we primarily have that alpha-2,6 linkage. So we're blessed with a type of linkage that this virus cannot get into. What we worry about is if this virus could reassort with a virus that can attach to 2,6 linkages, and then it could infect us. It's interesting to note that pigs have both the 2,3 linkage and the 2,6 linkage. We have the 2,3 linkage, but it's way down into our lungs. It's not in our upper, to any extent, in our upper respiratory tree where the virus first enters our body. So this spells this out in a cartoon fashion. Humans have in the upper respiratory tract where the arrow is, on the symbol of humans, we have primarily the alpha-2,6 linkage, but the virus has a very difficult time attaching to and getting into our cells. We have both the alpha-2,6 and the alpha-2,3 in our lungs, but the way the virus gets into our lungs is by first multiplying in our upper airways. Pigs are pretty much like humans. So we always worry when we see an influenza virus infect pigs because they're so similar to us. Birds, on the other hand, as I mentioned, just have the alpha-2,3 linkage. So that's the barrier, the major barrier for preventing avian influenza becoming a humanized form. So the bottom line to this discussion is H5 viruses cannot effectively reproduce themselves in the upper respiratory tract, fortunately. Thus, they cannot easily be transmitted from one person to another. If they could multiply in our upper respiratory tract, hundreds of viruses would very quickly become millions of viruses and then billions of viruses that would then travel down from our throats and our nose into our trachea, bronchi, and into our lungs. The humanized strains of influenza A can reproduce in the upper respiratory tract and travel down into the lungs and cause pneumonia. So the question, of course, is, will H5N1 become humanized? What does H5N1 look like in these 70 cases? Well, in some, it causes no symptoms at all. We know this from some studies where people have antibodies to the virus, particularly large animal veterinarians, and they have no history of having been sick. Sometimes it causes a mild conjunctivitis. This is particularly in the dairy herds, where people working in the dairy herds can get splashes of milk, as I was saying, that can get onto their conjunctiva and gives you pink eye, a red eye. Pretty mild disease. We've seen some cases where it's a little more severe, causing a sore throat, nasal congestion, a very mild cough, and the conjunctivitis. We've seen rare cases that are moderate, where they have fever, cough, body aches, headaches, and fatigue, the classical influenza that we all know. And unfortunately, we've seen, as I mentioned, 4 pretty severe cases, one of them resulting in death. This is where the influenza viruses leads to pneumonia. Less commonly, this virus can cause diarrhea, nausea, vomiting, and seizures, but that's pretty unusual. So if we look clinically, globally from 2003 to May 2023, January 2003 to May 23, so a 20-year span, there were 876 cases of avian influenza documented. This is from 23 different countries. 458 were fatal. That's a mortality rate, case fatality rate of 52%. Now, this 876 cases is a vast underestimate of the number of humans infected. These 876 cases were recognized because people were very sick and they were in hospitals where a diagnosis could be made. So there are probably many, many fold greater number of cases that occurred, which would drive down very quickly that case fatality rate of close to 50%. It would drive it way down, but still very serious. And I'll show you some numbers about that in a little while. So the bottom line to this is the clinical picture of H5N1 disease is indistinguishable from influenza viruses, other influenza viruses, from respiratory syncytial virus, RSV, and from COVID-19. You just can't tell looking at patients. What we look for is an epidemiologic history. Are you working in a dairy? Do you work with birds? Do you have birds in your backyard, for example? And conjunctivitis is really the tip-off, because while conjunctivitis can occur with other influenza viruses, RSV and COVID, it's less common. The other point is that if H5N1 or another avian influenza virus becomes humanized, we don't know what the mortality rate would be. To date, we have 70 cases. We have 1 fatality, which would suggest a fairly low mortality rate, case fatality rate. In terms of treatment, there are no clinical trials. All the data is observational. What we've learned so far is that all of the clades, or this particular clade in particular, the 2.3.4.4, they're susceptible to our antiviral agents with rare exception. We know that treatment works best if it's initiated very early in the course of illness. So let's now turn to prevention. And I'll look at both personal protection or prevention, occupational prevention, and then let's look at preparedness. In terms of personal prevention, a very large share of the public are really unsure about the recommendations for how to prevent avian influenza. This is from a Kaiser Family Foundation study that was done last month that asked the question, as far as you know, do public health officials recommend each of the following to prevent getting sick from bird flu or not, or are you not sure? I just want to show you this first one. Blue would be yes, officials recommend this. The gray would be unsure, and the green would be no, officials do not recommend this. So do public health officials recommend avoiding close contact with sick animals? 45% believe yes, 48% unsure, and a small percentage, about 7%, no, they don't. Public health officials don't recommend that. Public health officials do recommend that. Second is, do public health officials avoid unpasteurized or raw milk products, consuming those? 39% said yes, 50% said unsure, and 11% said no. And of course, public health officials strongly recommend avoiding unpasteurized or raw milk products. So I think what this represents is a failure of public health adequately communicating to our public. And of course, we saw this in very early on in the COVID pandemic, with a lot of the misinformation and disinformation from the government, and specifically from the President of the United States at that time. So the advice in terms of personal prevention is minimize contact with wild birds or sick or dead poultry by wearing gloves, washing your hands with soap and water after touching the birds very carefully. Only consume pasteurized milk and milk products. While we haven't seen, as I mentioned, transmission from consuming unpasteurized milk, we know that unpasteurized milk from an infected cow that can appear normal has billions of viral particles in it. And we also know that cats can easily get infected from drinking unpasteurized milk. We know that cats, feral cats around dairies, often have gotten infected and died from this. Felines are particularly susceptible to this virus, much more so than canines. I just have on the side here beliefs about raw milk. This was also the Kaiser, no, this was an APPC survey done in June of 24. The question was, is raw milk safer, less safe, or just as safe to drink as pasteurized milk? 47% of the population felt that it was less safe to drink. That's correct. Not just for avian influenza, but for many other bacteria like Salmonella and Listeria. 30% weren't sure. 15% it was just as safe to drink as pasteurized milk. And 9% believed that unpasteurized milk was safer to drink than pasteurized milk. So again, we're not adequately communicating to the public. The other question was, how effective is pasteurization at killing bacteria and viruses? 54% believed it was very effective. 22% believed it was somewhat effective. 20% weren't sure. 3% not too effective. And about 1% not effective at all. It's very effective. In terms of, for those of you who have cats or pets, avoid feeding pets raw food or raw milk. We've documented now that raw pet food can be contaminated with avian influenza virus and other pathogenic bacteria, but avian influenza virus, as I mentioned, raw milk can, and we've documented that both raw food and raw milk have transmitted the virus to cats, where they have a very significant mortality rate. If your pet has eaten raw food and shows signs of sickness, obviously talk to your veterinarian and isolate your pet from yourself as much as you can and others until you have the vet check the cat out. And if possible, and I know this is not possible for some cats, but keep your cats indoors where they're much safer, because cats have a lot of contact with wild birds, and we know that wild birds are the source of this virus. If you're walking your dog, avoid eating dead or sick animals, pretty obvious. But again, canines are much more resistant to getting infected, much less getting sick from this virus. In terms of occupational, I'll just go over this briefly. In hospitals, we put people, we identify them quickly as somebody who may be at risk for avian influenza. We put them in what's called airborne isolation. Biosecurity in the workplace is really critical. Personal protective equipment, PPE, control of air entering and leaving. For example, where we keep the birds is terribly important because the wild birds are the source for these infections in the caged birds, where you have thousands and thousands of birds where the air comes in from the outside. So the wild bird may not get inside, but the wild bird feces and saliva will dry in the soil around there and get aerosolized and blow into where the birds are being kept. And that's probably how they get infected. So it's terribly important to deal with that. And in dairies, making sure that milking equipment is cleaned adequately between cows, because it's a 24/7 operation, making sure that you're wearing the proper PPE, which is difficult to do, particularly during the day when it's hot. Making sure that when you leave the dairy, you leave the clothes that you were wearing at that dairy and don't take them to home, or if you're going to work somewhere else with another dairy. On the right-hand side, you see what the new administration has proposed for fighting avian influenza and lowering egg prices, is what they're saying. This is taken from the USDA site. This is a $1 billion plan where they look at they're trying to improve biosecurity, speed the repopulation of birds once they're killed. I mean, just as an aside, once a bird becomes infected where there may be 10 or 20 or 30,000 birds, we know that within days, the entire flock's going to be infected. These birds are genetically identical. So it's not like you have some birds with different genes than others, and so some will be more resistant than others. There's no immunity in any of these birds. If one gets infected, they're essentially all going to get infected. It's a miserable death for these birds. It's very gruesome when you see pictures of this. So the entire bird population has to be culled. Cutting red tape, innovative protection. They're talking about vaccines and therapeutic, improving the research on that. And adjusting trade. Right now, if a bird is vaccinated, which we're not vaccinating birds, a lot of countries will not accept those birds because they're concerned that they won't be able to identify which birds are infected in terms of screening tests. So that's being worked on. It's interesting to look at this. We know that this problem is a serious problem also in dairies, but there's nothing from the USDA, that is from the government, to address what's going on in dairies. All of this is directed towards birds. And the reason for that is economics. The reason for that is that Trump promised that on the day he became president, that infamous day of January 20th, 2025, that the prices of eggs would come down. In terms of the prices of eggs, on the left-hand side, you see where we are. And we see that the prices overall have dropped. In the orange is where we are, at $3.27 per dozen. Certainly not in California right now, but nationally, that's the price. So there's been a significant drop. We're still above where we've been, but we have come down. Why is that? It's due to two things. One is a slowdown in bird flu epidemics recently. The temperature is starting to warm up, that a lot of the flight patterns of birds coming from other parts of the world, the flybys through North America to Central and South America, that's slowed down quite a bit. So we're seeing fewer birds getting infected and fewer large bird factories having to be culled. And also the price of the eggs that was so high that the demand decreased. In terms of prevention, preparedness is critical. we need much more robust epidemiology. That is, we need to have the dairies and the where the birds are kept for both meat as well as eggs. We need to have many more epidemiologists in there working to try to understand better how the virus is being transmitted, both cow to cow or bird to bird, and also how it's being transmitted to humans. We need more wastewater testing, and we need more bulk milk testing. Right now, I think there are 18 states that are cooperating with bulk milk testing. What I'm talking about here is that you take, let's take the state of California, we'll take X number of dairies, and we'll take an aliquot from each of those dairies of milk, and we'll test to see if there's any H5N1, and if there is, we'll figure out which one it came from. That's a very valuable tool, and we're only doing it in 18 of the 50 states. We need much more emphasis on vaccine and therapeutic developments, both human as well as animals, and we need public health expertise right now. So let's talk about public health expertise in the United States right now. The Trump administration has not yet staffed the Office of Pandemic Preparedness and Response. There's only one staffer reportedly remaining in that. The NIH has frozen funding for research into vaccine hesitancy, implying that the agency was no longer worried about falling immunization rates or what could be done to reassure parents about risks. Kennedy suggested that we just let the bird flu rip in poultry farms. He had the idea that if we let it just burn itself through these poultry farms, that those chickens that didn't get sick would be resistant, and then we could start breeding those chickens. Well, as I told you before, these poultry farms, all the chickens are genetically identical. It's not like nature where you can see natural selection take place. This would be absolutely, letting it rip would be absolutely disastrous. This is taken from an article by David Wallace Wells in the New York Times on this 19th of this month. Around the country, scientists are racing to delete the term mRNA from their grant proposals, worrying that any hint of a reference to miraculous COVID vaccines will imperil funding for the countless promising possible future applications of the technology, some of them potentially even more miraculous. mRNA technology is not just for vaccines, it's for therapeutics, many different types of therapeutics, including cancer. It's one of the most powerful tools that we've discovered in the last many years. So proposing mRNA research now is not going to get you funded through the NIH. And Trump administration abruptly cuts billions from state health services. And the HHS scraps studies of vaccines and treatments for future pandemics. And 10,000 federal health workers to be laid off. So in terms of preparedness, I think one can say that we were much better prepared before January 20th of this year. We are very ill prepared, much worse than we have been in a long, long time. So the final question I want to address with you is, will bird flu spark a human pandemic? And this is roulette. This is a picture of the influenza virus on a roulette wheel. And there's the phrase that's very popular, the pandemic clock is ticking. We just don't know what time it is. And just as a warning, anytime anybody tells you to predict something, be skeptical. The Gallup poll predicted that Truman was going to lose by at least 5 percentage points, as I recall. And he won by 3.5 percentage points. So will bird flu spark a human pandemic? And will it be sustained? Looking at the literature, I think most people are guessing, and I'm emphasizing guessing, a 5% chance that H5N1 starts a sustained pandemic in humans in the next year. 1 out of 20 chance for that. If we look over the next 20 years, about a 1 in 2 chance. Why? It's because this virus, this particular clade, has adapted very well to many different types of mammals, just not to Homo sapiens and some other mammals yet. It's not going to go away, or it's highly likely unlikely it's going to go away. It's going to remain in a multiple animal reservoir, constantly experimenting to find new hosts that are not immune to it, which would mean different mammals. And the question is, will it find us? So the chances of that happening goes up about tenfold if we have 20 years of experience with this virus. And then if it does cause a sustained pandemic in humans, what's the case fatality rate going to be? So let me give you a little historical perspective. The H1N1 pandemic that I mentioned earlier had a case fatality rate of somewhere between 2 and 5%. Contrast that, for example, with COVID, that has a case fatality rate of about 0.7%. And COVID has killed here in the United States, documented a little over 1.2 million people in 4 years. Probably that number is closer to about 18 to 20 million, but we just don't have, 10 to 12 million, but we just don't have good data to support that. So 0.7% kills a lot of people. And the H1N1 in 1918, 1919 was somewhere between 2 and 5%. The H2N2 pandemic of 57 and 58 had a case fatality rate of 0.2%. The H3N2 pandemic of 68, 69 was also 0.2%. The H1N1 pandemic that occurred in 2009, 2010 had a case fatality rate of 0.01%, 200,000 excess deaths worldwide. On a typical influenza year, every year, the case fatality rate is around 0.1%. So that gives us a historical look at what we could potentially estimate the case fatality rate to be. So if it does cause a sustained pandemic in the next few years, a guess is that about a 30% chance it's going to be as bad as a normal seasonal flu. So to date, there have been 23,000 excess deaths from influenza between late October and now. That number will probably reach about 30,000 excess deaths here in the United States by the end of this influenza season. This is a moderately bad year. There's roughly about a 63% chance that it's between 2 and 10 times as bad, more like the Hong Kong flu of 1968 or the Asian flu of 58. There's about a 6% chance it's between 10 and 100 times as bad. That was the H1N1 of 1918. And less than about a 1% chance it's more than 100 times as bad. That would be unprecedented. So that's the best we know right now. So I'll leave you with this. This is Pandora, who opens the box, or in this case, a jar, which probably was, and she lets out all the evils, recognizing that she's done something terrible. She closes it and leaves one thing in it. And I always close my talks with this. What she left in it was hope. So thank you. And